And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is convening hundreds of U.S. military commanders worldwide for a meeting next week. Joining us now live to discuss is Thomas Barnett, publisher of Global Throughlines on Substack. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. So far, there's no details yet on what the topic of discussion will be, but I want to get your take on this. What kind of issue do you think could prompt a gathering of this scale on such a short notice?
Well, there's two categories. There's something in the world that's happening that is of such urgency and such danger that you have to have this kind of meeting, or there's something internal. And I just don't see the external problem out there commanding this sort of attention or effort. I think you're really looking at finally the sort of treatment that other U.S. departments received at the hands of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, back earlier in the year. I think you're looking at that level of transformation, cutting, reorganization, whatever you want to call it. I think it's going to be announced as a major package. It'll say, in effect, these are the cuts we're making. These are where we're trimming back. This is where we're going to put our money in the future. This is how we're going to shrink the number of flag officers in the system. This is how we're going to consolidate commands around the world. And this is how it relates to the way that we view the threat environment externally. I think more ominously, there's the potential for some sort of loyalty oath dynamic going on in this situation where officers are asked to pledge themselves to this new situation in a way that might suggest they're prioritizing the needs of the administration over the defense of the Constitution. That's what I think critics would fear. But I do think it's inevitable. You're going to see a formal announcement regarding how we are going to focus much more on the Western Hemisphere going forward.
A formal announcement, definitely something major to watch out for. And meanwhile, just hours ago, President Trump signed an executive order that will pave the way for TikTok to come under American ownership finally. And here's Vice President J.D. Vance announcing the deal alongside the president today. Watch.
But were there legitimate concerns when it comes to safety?
From my standpoint, no, because the people that own it are, they're not China-centric, they're USA-centric, and they're very smart people.
But this deal really does mean that Americans can use TikTok, but actually use it with more confidence than they had in the past, because their data is going to be secure and it's not going to be used as a propaganda weapon against our fellow citizens.
So, of course, we're still waiting to see more details of this framework. But as part of it, administration says there will be a new joint venture between China and the U.S., with American investors holding a majority stake in TikTok and potentially operationally controlling the algorithm. Do you think this will address the national security concerns that a lot of lawmakers have been voicing throughout the years?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to retrain the engines in TikTok according to U.S. data. They're going to protect that data. They're going to control that data. I think that's all very positive. I think what's interesting about this deal is twofold. One, the fact that the U.S. government isn't taking any sort of direct stake like it has in some of these other most recent deals. So it's putting a lot of faith in Oracle, and I think Oracle deserves that faith from the U.S. government being such an important player in our information technology ecosystem. The second thing I would note about this deal is the precedence of it. I mean, it is really different. We've never had this kind of deal with the Chinese before. The Chinese have never imposed this sort of deal on American companies operating in China before. So I really wonder about, are we going to face a future in which the Chinese try to do similar things to American companies operating in China, as we just did to TikTok operating in the United States? Or if this is potentially a precedent for a larger international rule set on cyber sovereignty. I mean, there may be a lot of countries that copy this behavior with regard to China or with regard to one another. So the precedence here, I think, is really the interesting thing. I think overall it's a solid deal. It makes sense for the U.S. There is enough security protection. China gets to keep control of its IP, but I mean, we really get to operate it and we get to mine all the big data that comes out of it.
So China has yet to formally respond to the EO assigned today yet, but they did strike a cautious note last week saying that companies were free to conduct, quote, commercial negotiations based on market rules. So in your assessment, will China actually stay faithful to whatever framework was achieved today? And like you said, this is uncharted waters for both sides. Do we have enough confidence that China is actually going to keep its word in giving its data or partially the algorithm control over to U.S. companies without trying to compromise them?
I think it's going to be part of a larger rearrangement of our relationship, and I think it ties into the whole question of soybean purchases by the Chinese and other things. I think a lot of items are on the table right now. Yeah, I do think the Chinese will honor this deal with regard to the United States because it will cost them too much not to do so. I don't think it will set any big precedent for how they behave with smaller countries around the world, where they'll be more dominant and use this sort of leverage to get diplomatic outcomes as they see fit. So I think it's a reasonable trade-off. I think the key here for America is not to make the Chinese look like they're losing face in this transaction, and I think they've accomplished that.
Well, remains to be seen then. We have heard the administration complaining about China violating trade agreements as well. But let's turn to agriculture, which you also touched on just now as well. With trade tensions, of course, still simmering, China has been actually pulling back on buying American soybeans, which you just mentioned, and is now leaning more on South American suppliers instead. Do you think the U.S. is doing enough to diversify its export markets on the security side? And which country could potentially become the next main buyer?
The answer is none, to be honest. If you look at global markets in soybeans, China buys almost 2/3 of the soybeans out there. Okay, so they are close to a monopsony, a very dominant buyer. We were the primary supplier prior to the first Trump administration. They got into that trade war tussle with the Chinese then, and the Chinese decided to switch a lot of their purchases to South America. Now they are playing hardball in anticipation of this current tariff fight. China has stockpiled 2 years worth of soybeans. Brazil had a record harvest last year. Things are looking good for this year. Meanwhile, in America, you have soybean farmers looking at no market for their exports. And we're going to see American supply centers fill up very quickly. We're going to see a lot of this get dumped at very low value. It's going to be very stressful for American farms. And you have agricultural experts in the United States talking about Farmageddon as an outcome. So there is no short answer to that. They really do have tremendous leverage over us. And it goes to show you that in the global system, you think supply gives you power, but really it's demand that gives you power. And China has tremendous demand. Nobody uses soybeans like China. And we have become reliant on them over the years. And then we very, somewhat recklessly, I would argue, exposed ourselves to this leveraged vulnerability in the middle of this talk. For China to change its mind on this issue, they're going to get some things out of the United States, maybe some big things.
Well, as the administration vows to get the upper hand in trade negotiations, of course, it's going to be remaining to be seen if the larger trade deal, how that's going to come down to as well. Thomas Barnett, thank you so much for your insights today. Appreciate it.